Hey y'all, this story I'm about to share with you is so good that I couldn't even think up a title for this story. I'm still thinking about what to call this video and I can't come up with anything. But it's so interesting and so well written, and it's 20 or 25 minutes long. I just think you're going to love it. If you wear dentures, put that adhesive on them, because if you don't, you're going to spit them out on the table. Because this story's going to blow you away. Alright, here we go. This story, or series of encounters, is written by Maggie in Canada. And I read a whole list of a bunch of people in different countries that listen to this channel. And I left out Canada, but it's not because I don't love Canadians. I actually have 2 or 3 good friends up there that I speak to on a regular basis. But it just slipped my mind. So, no offense. But Maggie's in Canada, and she worked really hard on this, and it's a lengthy encounter story, but it's great, so sit back and enjoy her story. The most recent encounter occurred on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Back then, the central part of the island was a true mountain wilderness of pristine old-growth firs, spruce, and various other conifers, so it never surprised me when wildlife put in an appearance in parts of town. For example, the black bear sleeping in our barn at one place we rented, and deer wandering down the rail lines onto the city streets within mere blocks of the downtown business area. Sad to say, the logging industry has decimated 90% of the possible habitat where these more common animals, let alone my giant hairy acquaintances, lived or could potentially move to at the time of this encounter. It absolutely infuriates me to the point of tears. I hope they found a safe haven along with all the other displaced wildlife. I spent my childhood and youthful summers at the family island on the west arm of Lake Nipissing, Ontario, from 1959 until 1976. You know, let me stop right here, and I want to just interject this. I said a minute ago that I love Canadians, and I do. I love the country, but y'all are going to have to start naming your rivers, cities, towns, and places something that a redneck can pronounce. But I digress. Squirrel! I can't say I ever hunted anything but squirrels with a longbow, but I was an avid fisherman. As long as I put on my life jacket, I was allowed to roam free on the 7-acre island once I got around 10 years old. I even camped out alone at night many times. I often think about writing a book about these summers. Most people born since 2000 simply never have a chance to grow up like we did. Anyway, on to my Bigfoot encounters. I've actually had 2 Sasquatch sightings, thousands of miles and 27 years apart. The first was when I was 5 or 6 at our family's summer cottage at Trout Lake, Ontario. It was nighttime and I was in bed staring at the moon through the window, which was up high on the wall. Suddenly, a face looked into the window and a huge hand splayed on the panes for a few seconds. Being a curious little girl, I stood up on the bed and leaned against the wall to get a better look. To my young mind, it looked sort of cross between a monkey and an extremely tall, hairy person. Its head and shoulders were covered with hair, but for its face, it had friendly eyes and seemed to smile, so I waved at it and it waved back. I hopped down off the bed and went to get my dad, but when I got back to the bedroom, the face was gone, and of course nobody believed me. In the morning, however, I dragged my Uncle John, who was 21, around the back, and we found huge, barefoot, man-like footprints in the soft dirt and muddy handprints around the window. Later in the morning, my dad got some neighbors together, and they all went looking in the woods, but thankfully, they never found anything. I should mention that the window in question was at least 7 feet up the outside of the wall. My second encounter came when I was 33 years old on Vancouver Island, British Columbia. I was camping for a few days while my apartment plumbing was being repaired. This was the last 3 days of April in 1988. At that time of the month, I didn't have the extra money to stay in a motel, nor could I anyway due to my gigantic 150-pound King Doberman Rottweiler Coonhound cross. No matter, he was a perfect gentleman and never barked. Dubers was in fact a retired police canine with impeccable manners and training. To give you an idea of his size, he could put his paws on top of a full-size fridge and get things off the top. So very big doggo as opposed to 5'2" little old mama, me. I packed up my tent, my fishing gear, sleeping bag, dog bed, blanket, and chow, Coleman lanterns, wire basket toaster, iron skillet, a pot I could hang over a fire pit, cooking utensils, and then to the store for groceries, including a few dozen of my favorite kinds of apples. We set out on April the 27th right afternoon, on a clear 50-degree day. I had scoped out the site I planned on camping at the day before. It was a hidden spot on the bank of the Nanaimo River, accessed by an almost invisible semi-overgrown turnoff. Once I'd parked, there was no way anybody driving by was going to see my vehicle through the snarl of bushes. It was a lovely, open clearing right beside the river, the bank no more than 100 feet away, with a flat rock shore from which I planned to fish. There was even a humongous stump that figured I'd use it as a table. I bet 10 adults could have joined hands and not quite been able to form a complete ring around this stump. Just imagine how big it was before some blithering idiot cut it down. I let my excited boy out of the car and went about setting up our 4-man tent. We needed a big tent because I had a big dog. Duber's attention was focused on the opposite bank. He was sitting attentively and silently, apparently listening to something interesting, his stubby tail almost wagging clear off his backside. I grabbed my rod and tackle box and walked down beside him. He barely noticed me until I spoke to him and gave him his command to lie down and stay. After 3 hours of fruitless casting, I gave up because I was hungry. We headed back to the camp, where I stowed the gear and then went collecting firewood and rocks to make a fire circle on a large, bare, rocky area a few yards from the stump and tent. Dubers obligingly helped by dragging branches along. Wieners and beans and toast would be the meal for tonight. I had bought a couple of big bags of red delicious apples in town and dumped the 24 of them into a wicker basket which I'd left on the stump table. Yes, I guess you would call me an appleholic. I even wrapped 2 in foil and tossed them in the coals to roast. It was dark by now, and I sprawled out on my back on top of the stump for a few hours, gazing up at the incredible night sky, which was unmarred by the garnish of glared city lights. Dubers, on the other hand, was back to staring off in the distance with his tail beating against my hip, tilting his head side to side, obviously hearing something my inadequate human ears could not. I wasn't about to allow him out of my sight, and I made sure that he stayed put. We took to our respective beds shortly thereafter, safely zipped into the tent with a small battery-powered lantern dangling from the center of the ceiling, casting a dim light. As anyone who has ever been in the woods at night knows, it is anything but silent at night in the wilderness, and I fell asleep to a chorus of frog croaks, owl hoots, and the occasional distant coyote yip. Shortly before dawn, I was jostled awake by my dog, who was having a very energetic dream. I lay there watching him pedal his feet, wag his tail, and make weird chuffing noises. He seemed absolutely delighted by something for a few minutes before he stilled and started softly snoring, which lulled me back to sleep. I hauled myself out into the hazy, brisk morning and proceeded to make breakfast of ham and eggs in a cast-iron pan. Doggo and I thoroughly enjoyed that. Then, after pulling out my fishing gear and grabbing a few apples from the basket, we wandered back down to the river, where Dubers busied himself nose to the ground, apparently following a scent back and forth all over the area, while I fished, again unsuccessfully, from different spots along the bank for the next few hours. There was a light ground fog hovering over everything, water, field, and camp. Kind of eerie, really. Suddenly, a loud racket started up on the other side of the river. It sounded like pieces of wood being smacked together. Dubers returned to my side, leaning against my leg, and was once again focused on the other side of the river, whining and wagging his entire furry body. This was starting to creep me out a bit. I supposed it might just be someone on the other side of the river building something. Nevertheless, it kind of weirded me out that the dog seemed so darn interested. We returned to the camp, and I made a beeline for the car, where I had a locked box stored under my driver's seat. I opened it and removed my revolver and my K-bar knife. Better to be safe than sorry, right? I stashed the gun under my pillow and strapped the knife sheath to my hip. Well, I felt a tad bit more secure and intended to heat up some soup when I caught sight of the basket of apples on the stump top. The basket was now sitting at one edge of the stump instead of the middle where I'd left it, and there were 3 trout laying beside it, hooked together by a long piece of thin tree branch threaded through their gills. What the heck? I looked around wildly and saw no sign of any other people at all. "Dubers, seek!" I muttered quietly, and after nosing around for a moment, he made his way, nose to the ground, down to the river bank and around some brush to the left of and concealed from where I'd been fishing. There he stopped and once again gazed across the way, wagging his tail and whining. Now, this dog had never been wrong about judging the intentions of other people in all the years I had owned him. His hackles rise and he grumbles quite menacingly if he does not trust someone, but he never attacks without hearing his command to do so. Body wags and whining means he wants to play with a friend. Stooping a little, I lined myself up behind him so I could look exactly where he was gazing, and I said, "Dubers, show me." Whereupon he immediately lifted his chin a bit and extended his neck forward and stared at a spot across the river. I peered between his ears to those shrubs and trees for at least 2 minutes, but I couldn't see a bloody thing except shadows and gently fluttering leaves and pine needles. Making a mental note to purchase binoculars sometime in the future, I straightened up and waved my hand while yelling, "Thanks for the fish! You're welcome to more apples if you want." I felt downright silly talking to thin air, but the dog was convinced someone was there, and I believed his senses more so than mine. I kind of hoped the mystery person would show up so I could ask what sort of tackle he or she were using. When we got back to the camp, I cleaned the fish and spitted them on a couple of old branches and stoked the coals a bit so the fish would cook slowly but not burn. It wasn't until I got around to cleaning up the fish guts that I noticed there were more apples missing out of the basket. 3 more to be exact, which got me wondering if our elusive fisherman had left 3 fish in trade for the other apples. Sounded like a fair trade to me. After lunch, we spent quite a while collecting firewood, a lot of it, using a tarp to haul it. Around 4 p.m. that wood knocking started up again, lasting several minutes, which oddly enough prompted me to take a sturdy length of branch and wallop the tree stump 3 times. I got a response of exactly 3 knocks from across the river. Coincidence, I thought, and hit the stump again 5 times, but was shocked when we heard 5 whacks a few seconds later. Alrighty then, communication by clack was strange, but it was communication nonetheless. Who am I to judge? I braved the chill of the mountain water in a bathing suit to give myself a cursory sponge bath, having worked up quite a sweat hauling and chopping wood. I also rinsed out my sweater and jeans after changing in the tent, hoping they wouldn't get blown off the branches I hung them on to dry. Duber spent the rest of the daylight hours with his nose to the ground following God knows what tracks all over the area, while I decided to do some carving of a pretty cool looking birch branch, which had a lovely big head-like knob and was pretty straight, so I aimed to make myself a walking stick with a face or something at the top. By dark, it was looking decidedly like something you'd find on a native totem pole. However, it was too dark to risk wielding my sharp tools any longer that day, so I packed them away and left the stick leaning on the stump when the dog and I went to bed for the night. Around 7 a.m., Dubers was doing his I gotta go dance, so I dressed and unzipped the tent. He barreled outside, and after a few minutes I heard him yipping and yapping. What the heck? That dog never made those kind of noises, like he was a silly puppy delighted to see someone. So out I went, immediately blinded by the sun to the east. Turning my back to the sun and also to the stump, I watched incredulously as my giant dog bounced around playing with some creature nearly as large as me, which was covered with dark auburn-colored hair. At first I thought bear, but no, it was running and leaping, literally upright on two legs, waving two very long arms around its head, and making weird whooping sounds. Okay, it wasn't a gorilla, not a chimp, not an orangutan. What in the holy hell was this thing? Duber, I yelled, and he immediately turned to me, as did this creature. I only used that name for my dog when I was upset with him about something, so he came to me immediately, all hang-doggy looking, and sat morosely at my side, all the while whining pathetically. His hairy pal was standing stock still, staring at the two of us like we were aliens or something, which made me giggle since I was looking at it with the very same thought. I looked down at my barely contained dog and gave him the sign he could go play again. The pair of them were off like a shot, silently chasing each other in circles. While watching them, I became aware of quiet crunching noises behind me, so I turned around, shading my eyes from the plasma ball in the sky. Oh dear Lord, Mommy and Daddy Creature were sitting quietly on the stump, watching the two kids playing while eating my apples. However, they brought more trout with them. I remembered the totally irrational thought coming to me that these critters obviously believed in fair trade, since they'd brought a whole stringer with them this time. Would the shocks ever end? When would I ever learn to bring a camera with me when I went camping? Nowadays, my cell phone is my constant companion wherever I go. But of course, there were no cell phones in those ancient times. Now I understand your skepticism at my odd reactions to these events, but I had spent 3 months of every single summer of my life in the wilderness. I was no stranger to moose, elk, deer, black bear, porcupines, and beaver. Native fur trappers stopped by quite regularly and even stuck around to help build our boathouse and wharf. But I felt no ill intent from these creatures, so yes, I kept about 10 feet distance from the two adults while drinking in every detail I could, all the while silently cussing myself out for not having a camera out of the car trunk. Dad was at least 8.5 feet tall. His shoulders were about half that in width. He was massive. Gigantic barrel chest tapered slightly to his hips, and thighs even more massive than his arms, which were more muscular than any human bodybuilder I had ever seen. His fingertips probably reached down slightly below his knees when he stood up straight. His hair was almost a chocolate brown. It was his face that captivated me, the obvious intelligence in his gaze once he turned it on me. He had dark brown expressive eyes that seemed very human-like to me. He picked up the walking stick that I'd been carving and carefully turned it in all angles before pointing at the face I'd been carving and then patting to his own chest and nodding. Then he leaned forward to hand it to me. He knew quite well it was meant to be the face of a Sasquatch. His mate did not come quite up to his shoulder, so she may have been around 7.5 feet tall. She was the same dark auburn shade as her offspring, but with darkish blonde streaks down her shoulders and back. She seemed reluctant to look directly at me, but kept a close eye on her child and my dog. It wasn't until just recently that I learned these creatures, normally hostile towards dogs, and tend to give them a wide berth. I'm assuming it was Dube's virtual silence that made them feel safer than usual around a dog, especially one as big as he is. At one point in time, he put a paw on her knee, and she got a surprised expression on her face. She seemed to relax after that and accepted another apple from the basket, which I'd surreptitiously managed to push back to the center of the stump. Our meeting did not last much longer once the young one had worn himself out, and he went to cuddle with his mother. Before they had a chance to leave, I pointed to the apples and tried to motion that they could take the rest if they wanted, which seemed to please them greatly, and they scooped them up into their hands. I called Dubers to my side, and we watched the threesome disappear around the embankment. He whined and soon sat staring across the stream again. I will confess to shedding more than a few tears of wonder that day. It's a shame I had to pack up and head back to civilization, if you want to call it that. That was probably the most amazing weekend of my life, and I hope to God they survived what the logging companies have done to their lands. And that's the end of her email. And what a feel-good story. I mean, Maggie, I'm just speechless. It's probably good because I would probably mess the whole story up with any commentary, but that was a beautiful story. We're going to let the story stand on its own. I loved it. It's a beautiful, sweet story. It's a feel-good story, and I love those types. That's going to do it for this video. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks so much.